The moment my grandson snatched the check from the table and smirked at me, I felt my dignity slip a little further into the pit he had been digging for months. "Grandpa, you don't have money for this," he said loud enough for the other tables to hear. His voice was dripping with mockery, a cruel kind of superiority only the young sometimes think they've earned by default. He waved the bill like a trophy, tossing it toward the waiter. "Put it on my card. He's broke." The laughter from the table behind us cut deeper than the words themselves. I wanted to tell them all that I wasn't broke, not yet, but my voice stuck like a stone in my throat. The waiter looked at me with something I couldn't immediately name, pity maybe, or suspicion. Then he walked away with the check. My grandson leaned back, chest puffed, like he had just rescued me from a life of embarrassment, while in truth he was the one dragging me through it. He didn't know that the card in my pocket could cover this meal 10 times over. He didn't know the life I had lived before his mother turned him against me. He didn't know the battles I'd already won, battles that left scars money couldn't erase. The restaurant smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, the kind of small-town diner I used to visit after long shifts when I was his age. I stared at the cracked linoleum floor, trying to breathe past the humiliation. Then the waiter returned. He set the folded receipt directly in front of my grandson, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think you should take a closer look." My grandson's smile faltered as he opened it, his face drained to the color of chalk. His lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he looked at me not with disdain, but with fear. And that was only the beginning. Because what that piece of paper revealed would not only shatter his arrogance, but ignite something inside me I thought had long died. The will to fight back, to take back what was mine, and to remind everyone, including my own blood, that I was not a man to be buried alive before my time. What would I do with that spark? That's the question, isn't it? I was 58 when humiliation became my daily bread. My name is Thomas Lewis, though most people here in town just call me Mr. Lewis. I used to run a small construction business, the kind of operation that built porches, renovated kitchens, and repaired the bones of old houses no one else wanted to touch. My hands shaped this town in ways no one remembers now. When my wife Gloria was alive, she used to say, "Tom, you don't just build homes. You give people a place where life can happen." She was right. That's what kept me going through long nights, splinters in my palms, the ache in my back. But when she passed, the business crumbled. Grief doesn't just hollow you out. It leaves holes in everything around you. Clients faded away, bills piled up, and by the time I could breathe again, I was no longer the man people called for work. My daughter moved states away, and my grandson Caleb grew up hearing only one side of the story, that I was a tired, broke old man who had wasted his chances. He believed it, and worse, he started wearing that belief like armor, against me. That day at the diner was supposed to be simple, just coffee, a chance to remind him I was still here, still capable of being part of his life. Instead, it turned into theater at my expense. He ordered the most expensive items, chuckled at my modest black coffee, then played the hero by paying. Except the receipt didn't just show numbers, because what Caleb didn't know, what nobody in that diner expected, was that I had already settled the bill in cash when I went to the restroom earlier. The waiter saw everything, the way my grandson puffed himself up, the way I shrank in my chair. Maybe the young man had a grandfather too, someone he still respected. Whatever it was, he slipped the receipt back with a note scrawled in pen, already paid by the gentleman in the suit. The suit, my suit, the last one Gloria ever bought me, the navy blue with the subtle pinstripes. I wore it because even if I had nothing else, I wanted Caleb to see dignity. And for the first time, he saw it, saw proof that his little performance was a lie. Caleb's pale face wasn't enough to erase the sting of his words, but it planted something in me, a seed. My silence all these months had been feeding his arrogance and I realized then that silence was my prison. He crumpled the receipt, shoved it into his pocket, and muttered, "Whatever." But his eyes betrayed him. For once, he couldn't laugh. For once, he looked small. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to, because I knew what was coming. That night, I sat alone in my small kitchen, the clock ticking like an old metronome, steady and accusing. I unfolded an old cigar box I kept tucked away in the cupboard. Inside were relics of the man I used to be, a pocket watch from my father, a letter Gloria wrote me when I won my first big contract, a black and white photo of me shaking hands with the mayor after restoring the town's library steps. Proof. Proof of a life my grandson had no idea existed. I thought about the laughter in the diner, about Caleb's smirk, about the way the world had quietly filed me under finished, and I asked myself, was this how my story ended? As a punchline, a burden, a man erased by time? No. The ember had already been lit. The next week, when Caleb dropped by my house, more out of obligation than affection, he walked into a scene he didn't expect. The suit hung pressed by the door. My work boots, long neglected, were polished. On the table lay blueprints from a job I had accepted that very morning. A neighbor needed his porch rebuilt, and I had agreed. Not for the money, though I wouldn't refuse it, but for the principle. "Grandpa," Caleb scoffed, eyeing the plans, "you can't seriously think you can still do this kind of work? You'll throw out your back." I smiled, a slow, patient smile. "Watch me." He rolled his eyes, but there was hesitation there, doubt creeping in. He didn't know the strength that comes not from muscles, but from memory, from the refusal to surrender. That was just the beginning of my quiet resistance. And here's where I'll pause, before I tell you about the porch, about the gossip that spread through the town, about the day Caleb's laughter finally turned into something else entirely. But first, let me ask you, have you ever lived something like this, where your own family tried to write you off? Share it in the comments and tell me what city you're from. More people deserve to know they're not alone in this fight. Because what came next in my story was far more than a porch. It was a reckoning. Caleb never believed I would actually finish that porch. He came around a few days later, leaning against his shiny car like a movie star, smirking as if waiting for me to collapse halfway through the work. The sun was heavy on my back, sweat dripping into my eyes, and the wood smelled sharp and raw beneath my hands. I could hear the saw biting through the planks, steady and alive, and for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Every cut, every nail hammered down was a reminder that these hands had built more than he could imagine. "You'll hurt yourself," he called out, not with concern but with mockery. "You're too old for this, Grandpa." I didn't answer him. I let the sound of the hammer speak for me. By the third day, the porch stood solid, every line clean, every joint firm. The neighbors began to stop by, one after another, each one surprised, impressed. Old Mrs. Jenkins from across the street brought me lemonade and whispered, "It's good to see you back at it, Tom." A man I hadn't spoken to in years offered me another small job, repairs on his garage door. Word was spreading, and Caleb, for the first time, didn't have anything smart to say. He stood there watching as the neighbors praised me, his jaw tight, his face unreadable. But I knew what I saw in his eyes. Doubt. Doubt in the story he had built about me. The resentment only grew from there. He didn't like that people were talking about me with respect. He didn't like that strangers saw strength where he had only seen weakness. One night, after I'd finished fixing up the garage door, I caught him rifling through my desk drawers. When I asked him what he was looking for, he sneered, "Proof. Proof that you're not some washed-up fraud pretending to still matter." His voice was sharp, but his hands trembled. That was when I realized he wasn't mocking me out of superiority. He was mocking me out of fear, fear that I still had value, and that meant he wasn't as powerful as he thought. I didn't argue with him. I simply closed the drawer and locked it, my eyes never leaving his. Silence is a weapon when used at the right moment. That silence shook him more than any words could. Days later, an envelope arrived in the mail with my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a letter from the town council, thanking me for volunteering to help restore the old church steps. I hadn't volunteered yet, but someone had put my name forward. My first thought was Gloria. She always believed I belonged to this community. My second thought was that maybe the universe was handing me another chance to rise. When I told Caleb about it, expecting maybe a flicker of pride, he burst out laughing. "A church? Grandpa, come on. You're doing charity now because no one would pay you." His cruelty was a knife twisting deeper, but I smiled anyway. "Not everything is about money," I said. He scoffed, shaking his head, but I caught that same flicker of unease in his eyes. He was losing his grip on the narrative he had built, and that terrified him. Working on the church steps brought back more than sweat and sore muscles. It brought back my past. The smell of dust and mortar, the rhythm of tools clanging, the quiet conversations with the younger men who came to help. It was like stepping into the life I thought I'd lost. Each evening, I walked home aching but alive. The town noticed. The pastor thanked me from the pulpit one Sunday, calling me a man of resilience, a man who still gave when he had every reason to stop. Caleb was in the pew beside me. His face burned red, his fists clenched tight on his lap. That was the day he finally snapped. "You're embarrassing me," he hissed as we walked out of the church. "You're embarrassing the whole family, acting like some hero when you're nothing but a relic." I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and turned to him. "A relic still stands," I said. His mouth opened, but no words came. That was the moment I knew. The battle lines were drawn. He would try to bury me deeper, and I would rise higher each time. The next test came faster than I expected. One evening, I came home to find my porch torn apart. Boards ripped out, nails scattered across the lawn, splinters sticking up like broken teeth. Caleb was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't need a confession. Only one person hated that porch enough to destroy it. My chest tightened with rage, but then a strange calm settled over me. He thought breaking the wood would break me. He didn't understand. He'd only lit a fire. The next morning, I started rebuilding. This time, neighbors came not just to watch, but to help. A teenager held the plank steady, a retired teacher handed me tools, and Mrs. Jenkins brought sandwiches. By dusk, the porch stood taller and stronger than before. The community had built it with me, and their hands were my shield. When Caleb returned and saw what had happened, his face went pale the way it had in the diner. He realized his war was no longer just with me. It was with the whole town's memory of who I really was. He stormed off without a word, but I knew he wasn't done, and neither was I, because somewhere deep inside I had started planning, not just to resist, not just to endure, but to remind him, and everyone, that dignity isn't something you can tear apart like wood. It's something you fight for until your last breath, and what I found in an old box hid. It was late that night when I finally decided to open the floorboards in my study. The old boards creaked under my knees as I pried them up with a crowbar, the same way I had done years ago when I first hid that box. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. Dust clung to the edges, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and secrets long buried. Inside lay a stack of documents, yellowed with time but still powerful enough to change everything. Bank certificates, property deeds, even shares from a construction company I had invested in decades earlier when my business was thriving. I had hidden them after Gloria's passing, too broken to care, too tired to deal with the vultures circling my life. I thought I'd forgotten them, but part of me always knew they'd be there when I needed them most. And now, I needed them. On top of the papers was a photograph, me and Gloria, smiling in front of the library steps we had rebuilt together. Her handwriting was on the back, "For when you forget who you are." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I let myself weep quietly in that dark room. The tears weren't of sorrow alone, they were of clarity. These documents weren't just money, they were proof of worth, legacy, and strength. The next morning, I wore my suit again, tucked the papers into a folder, and walked to the bank. The clerk looked at me with that same expression of doubt Caleb always carried, until she scanned the numbers. The account still alive, still mine. Her eyes widened, her tone changed. "Mr. Lewis, you're in an excellent position. You could do so much with this." I nodded, though inside I was burning. Not with greed, but with the thrill of reclaiming what was stolen from my name by neglect and dismissal. Caleb came over that afternoon, demanding answers about the porch. His eyes darted to the folder on the table. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Something you wouldn't understand," I replied, calm but firm. He snatched at it, but I placed my hand over the folder before he could. "This isn't for you, Caleb. This is mine." His smirk faltered. He didn't like doors closed to him. He didn't like power slipping through his fingers. "You're hiding something," he said bitterly. I met his gaze and answered, "Not hiding, preparing." That night I started making calls, reaching out to old contacts, people who still remembered the work I had done for this town. Within weeks, I was involved in a new project, revitalizing an abandoned community center that had fallen into decay. The town buzzed with excitement. They saw me as a man returning, a man still valuable. Caleb, however, saw me as a threat to the throne he thought he had built in my downfall. He began spreading whispers, that I was pretending, that I was senile, that I was chasing illusions. But the more he tried to drag me down, the more people rallied around me. The day we broke ground on the community center, dozens of townsfolk showed up. Some brought tools, others food, and many just their presence, as if to say, "We believe in you." Caleb stood at a distance, arms crossed, his expression sour. The pastor approached me during the lunch break, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Tom, what you're doing here, it matters. People need to see that resilience doesn't age." I nodded, feeling Gloria's spirit beside me. Caleb clenched his fists so tight I thought his knuckles would break. That night, he stormed into my house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. "You think you're special now? You think a few old papers and projects make you someone again? You're nothing, Grandpa. Nothing." His voice cracked, betraying his fury, but underneath it was fear. I let him rage, let him spew every insult, and when he was finished, I simply pointed to the cigar box still sitting open on the table. "Take a look," I said. He hesitated, then pulled out the photo of me and Gloria. His eyes flickered, confusion breaking through his anger. "She believed in me," I said softly. "And whether you do or not doesn't change who I am." He dropped the photo as if it burned his fingers. "You'll regret this," he spat before storming out. But he was wrong. The only regret I carried was waiting so long to rise. And soon, the real revenge, the kind that restores not just pride but justice, would begin. Because one of those documents in the box wasn't just a deed. It was ownership of land Caleb himself had been scheming to sell, thinking it had slipped from my hands. When I showed him the truth, his pale face in that diner would look like nothing compared to the color draining from him then. I waited for the right moment. Revenge, when served too soon, tastes bitter, but when allowed to simmer, it becomes a feast no one forgets. I knew Caleb had been whispering to developers about a patch of land outside town, a plot he thought was abandoned, worthless to me, ripe for him to snatch. What he didn't know was that the deed was in my possession all along, tucked beneath the floorboards with Gloria's photograph. I watched from a distance as he strutted into meetings, selling himself as the heir to my legacy, as if the sweat and blood of those acres belonged to him. His arrogance was a lantern in the dark, drawing all the moths to his flame. Then came the day he invited me to his so-called big announcement at the town hall. The place was crowded, the air buzzing with anticipation, the smell of fresh coffee and folding chairs lingering in the room. Caleb stood at the front in his polished suit, a salesman in every sense. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with practiced charm, "I'm here to tell you about a future that begins today. My family's land, our land, will soon be the site of a brand new shopping plaza, bringing jobs and money into this community." Applause rippled, though uncertain. Some clapped politely. Others frowned at the thought of losing one more piece of green to concrete. I let him bask in it for a moment, let him drink the illusion of control. Then I stood. My voice carried clear across the room. That's quite the dream, Caleb. But before you sell what isn't yours, perhaps you should show the people proof you own it. His face froze. The color drained from him like ink spilling into water. Murmurs spread through the hall. I walked slowly to the front, folder in hand, the navy suit hugging my shoulders as if Gloria herself had stitched it onto me. Because as it happens, I continued, pulling the deed from its sleeve, this land is mine, paid for, maintained, and never once surrendered. Gasps filled the room as I held the document high, the official stamp catching the overhead light. The mayor leaned forward, eyes wide, and nodded. He's right, she said, confirming the seal. Caleb stumbled over his words, his tongue tripping in desperation. That can't be. He's old, he's confused. His voice cracked. A boy caught lying in front of the whole town. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. My calm was the blade that cut deepest. Confused? No. Patient. Patient enough to let you dig your own grave with arrogance. I laid the deed on the table, the sound echoing louder than his speech had. The townsfolk began whispering, some shaking their heads, others smirking at his downfall. For once, they weren't laughing at me. They were laughing at him. Caleb's eyes darted toward the door, panic rising in his chest. But the humiliation had already settled like ash on his shoulders. He had tried to strip me of dignity, to bury me under shame. But instead he found himself naked before the very people whose respect he craved. I saw in that moment the same pale look he'd worn at the diner when the waiter exposed his lie, only now magnified tenfold. As the crowd dispersed, some clapped me on the back, others thanked me for standing tall. I walked home slowly, each step lighter than the last, the cool evening air tasting of victory. Yet beneath the triumph, I felt something deeper. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoration, about Gloria's faith in me, about reminding myself and everyone else that an old man isn't a relic until he chooses to be. That night, I sat on the porch we had rebuilt together. Me, the neighbors, the town, and let the silence wash over me. Caleb hadn't come by. He wouldn't. Not yet. But I knew he would return, not with humility, but with bitterness. And when he did, I'd be ready. Because revenge wasn't just one blow, one receipt, one deed. It was a slow unmasking, a steady climb until the truth shone so bright it left no shadows for arrogance to hide. And the next shadow I planned to drag him out of was the secret account he thought I didn't know about, the money he siphoned behind closed doors. When that truth came to light, his pale face in the diner, his collapse in the town hall, they would look like child's play compared to what was coming. I followed the thread quietly, like a cat circling a mouse hole, because I'd learned long ago that noise scares everything away. The deed had been a blade that opened his armor, but a blade without a plan is just metal. What I needed now was proof that couldn't be waved away as coincidence or the fog of an old man's memory. I started where most liars leave fingerprints: money. I went back to the cigar box and pulled out the oldest statement I could find, then compared it to my current accounts. My fingers trembled not from age but from a kind of righteous anticipation. The numbers were there, small and neat, like tracks in the snow. Payments that had been billed to community improvements were going into an account under Caleb's name. At first I thought I had misread them. Banks shuffle names, accounts get renamed, but the routing numbers matched, and the dates lined up with meetings where Caleb volunteered to handle funds on behalf of a neighborhood project. I printed copies at the library, the old machine whirring like it remembered me, and tucked them into the folder alongside the deed. I did something else too. I talked to people, not in the way a man looking for dirt talks, quietly, with respect. The way you ask about an old injury without prodding until the person trusts you enough to show the scar. Mrs. Jenkins remembered handing Caleb a check for the community center's initial cleanup day and being told it would be deposited into the town's fund. A young man who worked at the bank remembered Caleb's smiling face and a stack of deposit slips. Each testimony was a thread, and I wove them into a rope. I could have gone straight to the police, but justice wrapped in a badge sometimes looks cold and distant. What I wanted was immediate, public, and humiliating in the exact currency he'd used against me: reputation. So I arranged a meeting at the community center we just resurrected. I did it on a weekday afternoon when the town hall was quiet, but people still wandered by to see what had become of the old place. I placed the documents on a table near the entrance and asked the pastor to open his doors to anyone who wanted to see how the center was being funded. Word spread like spilled coffee, messy and fast. When the room filled with neighbors, I stood up in my navy suit, feeling Gloria's lined handwriting at the back of my mind. For when you forget who you are. I didn't call him out with drama. I didn't need to shout. I let the papers speak. I told the story simply: which checks were written, who endorsed them, which invoices never reached contractors, and where the money had gone. I handed copies to anyone who asked and watched as brows furrowed and whispers multiplied. Then I did the thing that makes liars sweat. I walked to the bank, requested an official ledger printout, and brought it back folded like a legal noose. The bank officer recognized me, the same clerk who'd widened her eyes at my resurrection, and she handed over the records with a quiet, almost conspiratorial, "You were right to come back." I laid that ledger on the table and let the numbers line up beside the deposit slips and the canceled checks that bore Caleb's signature. Silence fell heavy, like heat before a storm. A woman near the back started to cry, not from pity for me but from the sting of betrayal. She had given money thinking it served the town. Instead, it fed a young man's vanity. Caleb tried to stand, to laugh it off with that practiced charm. But his voice thinned as he saw the official stamp from the bank and the sequence of withdrawals that matched his habits. Small at first, then larger as he got bolder. He sputtered about misunderstandings about clerical errors, but his words were loose like socks on a wet day. The pastor, a man who had known me since I fixed the church steps, looked him in the eye and asked a simple question. "Why did you take money meant for people who can't afford another tax?" Caleb's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had no answer the church would accept, no scripture to make theft into charity. Neighbors I had helped in secret over the years, gone to men, single mothers, kids with scraped knees, stood up one by one and told what the center had meant to them: a warm meal, a safe night, a place to learn. Their faces were the evidence the law sometimes misses. Impact. When the town accountant, a woman precise as a metronome, ran Caleb's ledger through her eyes, she found irregularities so glaring even Caleb's backers had to look away. Checks made out to supplies that were actually cashed at an auto parts store, reimbursements that matched his credit card purchases, invoices for labor that had never been submitted. The accountant quietly called the county auditor, and within hours an investigator arrived, his badge and clipboard humming with bureaucracy. That evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the side of the community center gold, Caleb tried one last gambit, plea or apology, something to salvage. But his apology sounded like a practiced line from an infomercial, all cadence and no contrition. He left the room before anyone could answer, the door swinging closed behind him like a curtain on a bad play. I walked after him without haste. I caught him on the steps, hands shoved deep in his pockets, jaw clenched like he was trying to chew through shame. He looked at me and, for the first time since the diner, there was no sneer, only raw, open fear. "You set me up," he accused, voice small. "Set you up," I echoed, and the word felt theatrical in my mouth. "You set yourself up with your greed and your stories. I just found the receipts." He spat the word receipts like a curse. "You think this will fix everything? Selling land, stealing from the poor? Are you going to make me disappear, old man?" His threat was a child's stomp. I put my hand on his shoulder, a gesture that in another life might have been comfort. "No," I said. "I'm going to remind you that consequences are not punishments from God. They are truths delivered in daylight. You will answer for what you did." What followed was not a cinematic arrest or a courtroom confession on the front page. It was less tidy and more human. Caleb met with the investigator, the accountant, the pastor, and the ones he'd hurt. He wrote checks back where he could and signed agreements to make restitution. The county required paperwork and hearings. Men in suits and women with sharp pens asked hard questions. In the weeks that followed, he lost friends who had liked the idea of him more than the man he proved to be. He lost the easy smirk, the kind that hides a million small cruelties. I didn't dance on his ruin. I didn't want to be stained by the same bitterness that had once lodged in my chest when he mocked my coffee. Instead, I used the restitution to set up a small fund tied to the community center, transparent, audited, with receipts posted weekly, because I wanted the town to see that money can be an instrument of trust rather than a tool of secrecy. The pastor named it Gloria's Fund, and I felt a strange, fierce peace each time a child came in for tutoring or an old man sat with a hot meal. Caleb came around sometimes, eyes hollowed, trying to be helpful in clumsy ways, offering to paint a room, to haul boxes. The town watched him the way you watch a man trying to learn to walk again after a stroke. Patient, skeptical, unwilling to forget too quickly. He didn't ask for forgiveness and I didn't hand it to him like candy. Forgiveness, I'd learned, must be earned through steady, visible change. There were moments I felt cruel for not embracing him. Other times I felt cruel for having let him believe he could own what didn't belong to him. What I kept returning to was a single truth Gloria had once scrawled in a note and stuffed between my work gloves. Dignity is reclaimed not by one triumph, but by the accumulation of small, honest acts. So I taught the kids to use a hammer properly. I taught a young woman how to fill out a job application. I met with the bank to set up scholarships from the fund, and slowly the town's story about me shifted from pity to pride. Caleb watched these things happen with the kind of loneliness that once might have been arrogance. Sometimes he helped, sometimes he just sat and listened. He never again spoke to me in public with that cold edge of mockery, and that silence was worth more than any receipt. There were nights I thought about whether my revenge had been too mild, whether the scales had tilted enough to be fair. But justice measured differently here, not in how loudly you could humiliate a man, but in how thoroughly you restored what had been taken. The receipts and ledgers had been the instruments. The real victory was watching a community decide to choose dignity over gossip, service over spectacle. And in the quiet hours, when the center was empty and the air smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper, I would sit with Gloria's photograph and whisper thanks to a woman who believed in me long before anyone else did. Caleb kept his distance for a while, licking his wounds like a cornered dog. But I knew that pride doesn't heal quietly. Pride festers, and when it festers, it looks for an opening to lash out again. Weeks passed with the community center alive in a way it hadn't been in decades. Children spilled across the floors with books in hand. Old men played chess under buzzing fluorescent lights, and women who had once been strangers gathered to cook meals together. The air inside carried the smell of wood polish and fresh bread, a scent that wrapped around me like Gloria's embrace. Every hammer strike, every brush of paint, every smile that flickered across those walls became part of me, part of the new Thomas Lewis. But the shadow of Caleb lingered. One Saturday afternoon, as I finished patching a crack in the wall, I heard his voice at the doorway. "So this is it? Your little empire?" His tone carried bitterness, but not the triumphant swagger of before. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and there was a tremor in his voice he couldn't hide. I turned to face him, wiping plaster dust from my hands. "It's not mine, Caleb. It's ours. It's the town's." He stepped closer, his eyes darting around at the people inside. "You think these folks actually respect you? They're using you. You're a symbol, nothing more." I looked him in the eye, steady and calm. "Symbols last longer than mockery." He didn't have an answer for that. He left without another word. But I could feel the storm brewing. Days later, whispers began to reach me. Caleb was telling anyone who'd listen that I wasn't fit to handle money, that sooner or later I would make a mistake and the whole community center would collapse under my senile mismanagement. It might have stung once, but by then, I had something stronger than his gossip. I had receipts, transparency, and the trust of people who saw me working with their own eyes. Still, his poison dripped into a few ears. and I decided it was time to end this cycle once and for all. I invited him to a dinner at my house. Just him and me. The table was set with glorious china, the good plates I hadn't touched in years, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. When he arrived, he looked suspicious, as if expecting an ambush. He sat stiffly, barely touching the food. "I asked you here," I began, "because this war between us needs to end." He laughed bitterly. "War? You think this is some noble struggle? You humiliated me, Grandpa. You took everything from me." "No," I said firmly, my voice sharp enough to cut through his self-pity. "I took back what was already mine, what you tried to steal, and I showed the truth. That's not humiliation. That's justice." He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "You don't get it. All my life I've been in your shadow. Mom talked about you like you were some saint. Everyone in this town whispers about the man who built their porches, their homes. What about me? When do I get to be somebody?" For a moment, I saw not the arrogant boy but the wounded man beneath. His anger wasn't just greed, it was envy, fear, the gnawing desperation to matter. I leaned forward, my voice low. "Being somebody doesn't mean tearing down the people who came before you. It means building something of your own. If you can't do that, you'll never be more than a shadow." He went silent, staring at his plate. His hands trembled, not with rage this time, but with something closer to despair. He stood suddenly muttering, "I can't do this," and walked out into the night. The next morning, the whole town knew he had packed his bags. Someone saw him at the bus station, eyes hollow, luggage in hand. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. In the weeks that followed, the center thrived without his interference. I poured myself into it with a fervor I hadn't felt since Gloria was alive. Every nail driven, every child's laugh, every neighbor's handshake was a testament that I had risen from humiliation to restoration. But I knew Caleb's story wasn't finished. No one runs from their shadow forever. One evening, months later, I found a letter slipped under my door. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. It was from Caleb. "Grandpa, I can't face you, not yet. But I want you to know I'm trying. I got a job in another town. Small things, nothing like what you've done. But it's honest. I see now that I was wrong. Maybe one day I'll have the courage to come back and stand beside you instead of against you. Until then, thank you for showing me who I don't want to become." I sat there with the letter trembling in my hands. My eyes blurred, not from weakness, but from the weight of it all. The fight, the scars, the bitter words. I whispered to the empty room, to Gloria's picture on the mantel. Maybe he'll learn after all. That night, I stood on the porch we had rebuilt together, the wood cool beneath my bare feet, the stars sharp above. Revenge had burned hot in me once, and I had fed it until it gave me back my dignity. But what I felt now was something different. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. Because revenge can give you justice, but only hope can give you peace. The day I read Caleb's letter, something inside me shifted. For months, my heart had been a battlefield where humiliation, resentment, and revenge clashed like soldiers unwilling to surrender. I had won battles, yes, but the war within me had left scars that didn't bleed outward. They throbbed in silence, in the hours when the house was too quiet, in the nights when I reached across the bed and still half expected Gloria's hand to be there. That letter was not forgiveness, nor was it absolution, but it was an opening, a crack of light in a door that had been bolted shut for years. I carried it with me to the community center that afternoon, folded carefully in my breast pocket. Work was going on as usual. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint mixed with the sweetness of apple pie cooling in the kitchen, where a group of women prepared meals. Kids ran across the polished floors with soccer balls under their arms, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. In the corner, two old friends were playing dominoes, the clack of tiles steady as a heartbeat. I sat in my chair by the window, pulling the letter out once again, and read it until the words began to blur. A man walked up quietly and sat beside me. It was Henry, a retired teacher I'd once done work for years ago. He looked at the paper in my hands. "From Caleb?" he asked. I nodded. "Good," Henry said. "Good that he's reaching out. Men like him need time to learn what you already know." I sighed. "And what's that, Henry?" "That building something up is always harder and more worthwhile than tearing something down." His words sank into me like nails into oak. I looked around at the center, at the faces glowing in the warm light, at the sense of community that had bloomed from ashes. For a long time, I had thought revenge was the only answer, the only way to balance the scales. And it had been necessary to show Caleb and the world that I wasn't to be written off. But revenge alone doesn't build porches or feed children. It doesn't mend a church's steps or keep the lights on in a community hall. What builds is persistence. What builds is dignity. What builds is choosing to fight for something greater than yourself, even when your hands shake and your back aches. That evening, the pastor asked me to speak at a gathering. The whole town filled the hall, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, the smell of coffee and baked goods hanging in the air. They had come not just to celebrate the center, but to celebrate survival, our survival as individuals, as a community, as a memory that refused to fade. I walked up to the small stage, the letter still tucked inside my jacket. My knees ached as I climbed the steps, but my heart was steady. I began not with triumph, but with truth. Many of you know what happened between my grandson and me. You've seen the receipts, the deeds, the ledgers. You've seen the shame, the anger, the laughter at my expense. But I want to tell you something deeper tonight. I want to tell you what it feels like to be humiliated and then to rise again. The room fell silent, eyes fixed on me, breaths held. Humiliation is not just a sting. It's a poison. It seeps into your bones, convinces you that you don't matter, that you're already finished. My grandson once told a diner full of strangers that I couldn't afford a cup of coffee, and in that moment, I felt as if the whole world believed him. I sat there, ashamed, angry, broken, but I learned something that day, something I carry with me still. Dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I fought back not with fists, but with receipts, not with insults, but with work. I rebuilt a porch. I restored steps. I opened these doors with all of you by my side, and every nail, every laugh, every meal served here is proof that I am not finished, and neither are any of you. The applause rose, not thunderous but steady, heartfelt. It rolled through the hall like a tide, warm and unrelenting. I raised a hand, quieting them. But I also need to tell you this. Revenge, while sweet, is not the end of the road. It lit my fire, yes. It gave me strength to stand. But revenge alone leaves you standing on ashes. What matters is what you build after the fire. My grandson left this town in disgrace, but he wrote me a letter. He told me he's trying, that he's working honest jobs, that he wants to be better. I don't know if he will succeed. I don't know if he will ever truly understand. But I do know this. I will not let bitterness chain me again. I have chosen dignity. I have chosen hope. This time the applause shook the walls. Some people rose to their feet, clapping, nodding, eyes shining with tears. The pastor stepped up, embracing me tightly. That, he whispered, is the gospel of resilience. When the gathering ended, I walked home slowly under the night sky. The stars stretched above me, sharp and endless, and the cool air smelled faintly of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. I climbed the porch steps, the same porch that had been torn down and rebuilt stronger. I sat in my chair, the wood creaking softly, and let the night settle into my bones. Inside, on the mantel, Gloria's photograph watched over me. I raised a glass of water toward it and whispered, "We did it, love." We rose. The next morning, I opened the center early. Children arrived before school, eating the breakfasts volunteers had prepared. One boy, skinny, with clothes a little too small, sat beside me and asked, "Mr. Lewis, were you always this strong?" I smiled, shaking my head. "No, son. I was broken once. But strength is not about never breaking. It's about standing up again when everyone thinks you can't." He nodded, thoughtful, as if storing the words away for later. That was the legacy I wanted. Not wealth, not revenge, but the simple truth that even in our later years, even when the world tries to write us off, we still have chapters left to write. As I watched the boy eat his breakfast, I thought about Caleb again. I thought about the smirk at the diner, the pale face when the receipt came, the anger at the town hall, the trembling hands at my dinner table, the letter slipped under my door. I thought about how humiliation had almost broken me, how revenge had restored me, and how hope was guiding me now, and I realized something I wish I had known earlier. The greatest revenge against those who doubt you is not to destroy them, but to thrive so fully that their doubt becomes irrelevant. That morning, I opened the doors wide and let the sunlight flood the hall. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of laughter, the sight of neighbors working side by side. It was a hymn, louder than any insult, stronger than any receipt. And I ask you, the one listening to my story, have you ever been humiliated, written off, told you had nothing left to give? What would you do in my place? Would you surrender, or would you rise? Tell me in the comments. Tell me from your town, your street, your kitchen table, because someone out there needs to hear your fight too. As for me, I will keep rising until my last breath. And when they ask what my life stood for, I want the answer to be simple: dignity, resilience, and the unshakable truth that old men still have victories left to claim.